Hello, this is Carl Irwin with another Blender tutorial. This is the third tutorial in a series of PBR viewport shading tutorials utilizing the new Blender 2.78 release capabilities that involves the viewing of box map textures inside of the Blender internal viewport. So we're now able to apply box map textures inside of the viewport, and we're able to see those in real time. These are gaming sort of textures, and just to recap, in the first tutorial I showed you how to take an equirectangular projection environment map and convert that into a box map that can be used in the environment mapping texture slot. In the second tutorial, we discussed the creation of a shadow and a diffuse texture map. And what we did is we put together two different shaders, one that involved the diffuse texture and then another that involved the shadow mat itself, and then we got this combination where we could have these environment influenced lighting, yet still be able to see shadows being cast from a single OpenGL light or an array of OpenGL lights inside of the scene. And all of this done in such a way that it doesn't do any disservice to the environment lighting that is available from the diffuse textures that we have created from our equirectangular map. So that brings us to the present. We're going to talk about today in this third episode all things relating to reflectivity. We're going to make reflections, and we're going to, it seems easy that we'd be able to do this because we've already created a reflection map, but it's not quite so simple. We want to have the capability to have varying types of reflections. We want to have the ability to have kind of a roughened reflective surface that also has a Fresnel effect. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment here. However, one bit of housekeeping before we look at reflections. I want to take a quick look at the node setup that we used from the last tutorial. If we look here at the video, I actually got rid of this blend file, so I have to refer to my video here. I just want to show you the node setup real quick. And I know you can't see very well here, but I want to show you one minor error that I made that I want to correct here very quickly. What I did, if you go back and look at that tutorial, what we did is we placed some curve adjustments on the mixed output from the diffuse texture along with the shadow mat that was made from the diffuse texture. So remember, if you recall, we made a shadow mat based on the diffuse texture. And then we also made an additive mix from the diffuse texture that would add the colors from the diffuse texture back on again. And that was fine, except what we ended up with was adding these two curve adjustments, one to brighten up the curves for the highlights of the OpenGL light, and then one to darken the curves for the shadow of the OpenGL light. And that was an incorrect process. You want to avoid using curves to change the color of the environment color from the diffuse textures and the reflective textures that you've created. When you're trying to demonstrate the true lighting of the scene, you want to use those actual colors as much as possible. Instead, what we should have done is I should have placed a curve adjustment of some sort on the mat for the diffuse texture, so that early on I would be matting, or rather placing this curve on the mat itself, but not affecting the color of the diffuse texture. So this curve here for the shadow, this one here, actually should have been over here on this line for the influence in this mix node, in matting out the shadows and the highlights. And then later on, I should have, if I did apply any kind of curve for the highlight or the shadow, it should not have been a curve, but rather it should have just been an adjustment to the whites or the darks. So I just want to fix that very quickly and show you what I mean. And the second thing I want to bring up is that in the previous tutorial, we kind of looked at the environment lighting from the diffuse texture and the OpenGL light matte all together in one node. And what we really should do is split up those two processes into two separate node groups. And the reason for that is that you may have a situation where you have kind of an overcast environment where you don't use any OpenGL lights at all. And you want to be able to just rely on the diffuse texture to provide any kind of lighting within the scene. And if we have everything together, it means that you have to create another node from that, whereas we could have had one node just for the diffuse matte and the additive diffuse light, and then a separate node group for just the OpenGL matte. And that way we could have used them in chain, as a chain from one to the next to accomplish the same thing, or we could have left one or the other out, whatever the case may be. So it was a nice consolidated node group. However, it may have consolidated a little too much to benefit future materials. So let's fix that very quickly here. I'll show you what I'm talking about. If we look here, I have kind of the original setup here in the shadow matte down here, and if we tab into that, you can see that I have fixed the error. So over here on the shadow matte, rather than having the diffuse texture influence go directly into my mix node for my shadow color up here from my input, what I did is I placed a curve on it that would brighten up the lights so that we could more properly matte out the darks. Okay, so if I show you what that looks like, drop that into the output, you can see this affects this one right here. You can see what's happening. That's what the change is. Now, when this goes into the influence of the mix node, it doesn't pick up on the color, it just picks on the luminance of that. So the dark parts would be shadow, the light parts would be something that picks up the color of the environment a little bit more. Okay, so the output of that should look like this. You can see what's going on here is that it's just matting out kind of the darker parts a little bit more. From there we have the additive node here where we're adding back on the bright, the color from the diffuse texture, and that would look then like this. And then from there we go to the OpenGL light matte. You can see I do have some curves on here, but they're not curves. I'm just adjusting the brightness and the lightness. So I do one for the shadow to generate this darker shadow over here, and then I bump up the light color just to give a little bit more on the lit highlights over here. And then that output should look like this. Okay, so this is what that node group should look like. Now what I did from here is I took this first node group and I separated that. So this up to this mix node that's dealing all with the diffuse texture, I separated that into one node, and then I separated the OpenGL light side of this node group into another node group. So I can show you what that looks like here. With them separated, I have this for the diffuse lighting. And you can see essentially we're looking at the same thing here. I have my curve for my influence, and then I have a darken curve to darken out my input color, whatever that color is. And then I have my mix or my add node over here to add back on the color, the highlights from my diffuse texture, and then I have this output. So that looks like this. If I apply that, you can see on Suzanne over here, I'm getting the proper output. And this is what it looks like without the OpenGL light. You can see that this is not casting shadows on itself, except for the shadows that are determined by the diffuse texture itself. Okay. Now if I run that through this node, this is the shadow mask, and if I tab into that, You can see this is just the shadow mask side of that node group, the earlier node group. I have the highlights up here. Again, it's not a curve adjustment, but it's just a highlight adjustment. And then I have another one down here, which is for the shadow. And that is an adjustment to decrease the whites for the shadow side of it. And then the influence for that is the OpenGL light material. And then that on its own, if I would take this color and just plug it into the OpenGL node group and bring this out, you can see I'm getting my OpenGL shadow, but I don't have any color influence from my diffuse texture. I'm not getting any of that influence. I'm only getting the OpenGL shadow. Okay. Now if I pump my my diffuse lighting into my shadow mask, I get this output, which looks a lot like the original one. Okay, so this is just a little bit more useful to separate out these two sides of the original node group, and I just wanted to show that to you. So we're not going to need to use this shadow mask diffuse anymore. We can actually get rid of it. I will just delete that. Okay, so that node group has been replaced by these two node groups that can be used together or alone depending on the case. So if I have an overcast scene and I'm not using any OpenGL lights, I would just use my diffuse lighting and call it a day. There wouldn't be any shadow being cast from one object to the next. Okay, so if you need to pause and go back and rewind and check that out again, you can see. This scene does have an OpenGL light in it, so we'll use both of them together. Now, what we're going to look at right now is the idea of adding a reflection. Now, this should seem very easy. If I add another material, I have a reflective material already. I can go in here and pick my reflection. And you'll notice a couple of other materials. Don't worry about those. These are from future things that we're going to look at. I have a secondary kind of roughened reflection. We're going to look at a way to do that later on. I'm going to teach you a different way to make a rough reflection based on just the diffuse texture and the reflection texture and one extra texture that we need to make. But before we get into that, it seems easy that we would be able to just have a reflection texture by dropping in our reflective texture. So that's easy enough. You can see it's reflecting the ground. It's not reflecting this plate here. That's because if I wanted it to reflect the plate, I would need to make a separate reflective and diffuse box map. And I can do that. I would just base my box map on this Suzanne location using the same procedures I used before. It would pick up everything else in the scene, and I would be able to get reflections from any other object within the scene. Pretty simple kind of procedure there to do that. But right now it's reflecting the ground. I'll just get rid of this plane here so it makes a little bit more logical sense. You know, this seems easy enough. I would just do that. However, what if I want to have kind of a roughened reflective texture? And also, I need to address one other issue. You'll notice that this is not casting shadows. It's because it's not going through the diffuse, or rather the shadow mask. What if we did that? I believe I did this on the last tutorial just briefly. You could see what that output looked like. It left something a little to be desired. You can see that it is drawing shadows on itself, but this is a problem because mirrors do not cast shadows or do not receive shadows. You can only see the shadow on a mirror, I believe, if you are looking directly from the light source, or it might be from the shadow source. I can't remember which one it is. But otherwise, you don't really perceive a shadow on a mirror because a mirror is reflecting back the light that exists in front of it. Okay. However, a mirror finish that is rough would cast a shadow on itself because the roughness would accept shadows while the reflective part would reflect some of what is in front of it. Okay, so we want to find a way to be able to cast shadows on the rough mirror but not on the mirror that is completely clear. Okay, so let's see if we can sort this out here. Let's go back to my reflective texture. This is what a full mirror surface should look like in this scene. It should not have any kind of shadow cast on it. Let's go over here to this node. This is a node that I've already pre-made. I'm going to delete this. This is the one that we're going to make. And you'll notice on this node, I don't know if you can tell, but it's not, actually this one actually might be a complete mirror surface. Let's jump into this node group that I've made, and I'll show you what we're going to create, and then we'll go step by step and make it. Tab into it. You can see a few things in here. I've got my reflective texture coming in, my reflective material. I also have my diffuse material coming in, and I've placed a curve adjustment on this diffuse material to increase the highlights. This is okay because what we're going to use it for is actually a different kind of reflective surface, because the diffuse texture really is a reflective surface, and if we increase the contrast, put a contrast curve on it, it will start to look like a rough reflective surface. We're going to use that a little bit mixed with our other reflection. You see it comes into this mask here. There is two colors on it. There's a light color and then a dark color below it. Let me see here. This is the actual shadow mask that we have outside. So this is a way in which we're going to use our shadow mask to apply shadows to the roughened side of our material. Okay, so this is the shadow mask, and this color input is nonsense. It's a mistake that it's there. It's not actually being used. If I were to click on this and go to the node and click on collapse and hide unused sockets, you see it'll get rid of that. Up here, my reflective material is coming into this mix node, and it's being mixed with this shaded material. Let me just show you what this looks like. So this is the diffuse texture coming out, okay, which we've seen that before. This is the diffuse texture with the curve that brings out the highlights. This is the diffuse texture with the shadow mask. So it's casting a shadow on itself. It's picking up shadows as if this was kind of a high contrast version of the diffuse texture, but it's in the world with shadows being cast. All right. Now up here I have my regular reflective material coming out, which would look like that. And these two outputs are being mixed together using this interesting looking material here. Now what this is this is going to be a fresnel map. Now when you have a reflective material that is slightly rough, you will notice that the parts that are directly facing your viewpoint will be kind of hazy, whereas the normals that are facing away will have an increased mirror reflectivity, and that's because you're looking at it at an acute angle, and you're seeing more of the reflectivity there. So we're going to use this image here. We're going to create it and then use it to generate that kind of an effect. And it's also going to help us to create the roughened appearance a little bit more authentically. And then we're going to use a color ramp to get all the varying different degrees between that diffuse texture that we saw with the color curve and the shadow and absolute mirror reflectivity. So we're going to get everything kind of between those two extremes. All right. First things first, we need to generate this Fresnel map. So here's how we're going to do it. We're going to open up GIMP or any kind of other photo editor. We have to make an image. And we'll make our image, we'll just make it 400 by 400. It's a fairly simple gradient. It's white. We need to select kind of this fall off brush over here that's got a fairly gradual fall off. We're going to select the paint brush, and we're going to increase our size up to just under 400. So let's say about 370-ish is fine probably. And we want to select black. Now we want this to be fairly close to the center, so around 200 by 200 pixels. We can kind of approximate. It doesn't have to be exact, but right about here, whatever seems to look balanced and right. And we're just going to put a few clicks on here, maybe about 3 or 4 like that. And then we'll take this here and we'll go to the filters. We're going to put a Gaussian blur on it, just about 10 pixels big. just to kind of smooth it out a little bit. And this is our fresnel material. In fact, I might put one more dot on there just to get a little bit more of a extreme contrast. Hit that blur again. We'll export this out, and we'll save it as normal. I'm going to save it as normal. Well, actually, it says normal. We probably should have named that fresnel. It's going to be applied to the normal map, but we'll call this a fresnel texture. It's what you should do when you do it. We'll replace it. Export. Close that out. Discard the changes. Okay, now if we go in here, we need to generate a material. So what you would do is you would add another material. I've already done it. You want this material to be shadeless. And you would go to the texture slot and you would load in that image. And you want this mapping to be set as normal. Okay, you don't want it to be set as anything other than that. You want it to be set as normal so that the normals that are facing you will be black, and then the normals that are more oblique to your point of view will be on a gradient black towards white. Okay, so that's the Fresnel map. We're actually going to use this again later on in an upcoming tutorial where we're going to look at faking transparency and kind of a crystal sort of appearance. So that is coming up very soon in the future. Let's go back to our Suzanne, and we'll go to the composite here, see what's going on. If we tab into this, you see that this Fresnel material, which looks like this, is coming into a color ramp, and that color ramp is going to be used to determine how to map the diffuse texture against the reflective texture. Okay, so just to show you real quickly how the control will work, and then we'll build it. For example, if I want it to be completely reflective, my color ramp should be all white, because we're going to be applying the bottom input here, which is the absolute reflective material. If I want it to be somewhat rough, I would select this first input over here, and I would darken it down, and that would start to add in my darkened center of my Fresnel map, and it would mix in my diffuse texture, which has a contrast curve on it. Okay, so you can see it's starting to roughen up the texture a little bit, but you'll see that the parts that are oblique to my point of view have a higher level of reflectivity. If I really want to go all the way in on this for this input, I can select this and go make it entirely black, and now it's applying my Fresnel map exactly as you see it. So I've got a very rough kind of onward look, and then a high reflective Fresnel effect on the outside normals. Okay, you see how this is being applied here. Also, you'll notice that whenever I can see the Fresnel, there is a shadow being cast on it, which is true to life. That's how that would actually work. If I want this to be more rough, I can do several things. I can take my slider here, and I can slide my Fresnel dark side in. I could change this mapping here, make it ease if I want to kind of make that a little bit more of a smooth transition. So the further I slide it in, the more rough the texture becomes. But you see I still have a high gloss mirror edge on it. Okay. Now if I want to take that high gloss edge down, what I can do is go into the second input, and I can grab this and darken up that color, and it will start to mix in more of the diffuse texture. You see that it's still reflective. I can still see that in the Fresnel effect on the outside edges, but it's starting to cast shadow on itself, and it is looks more like a rough reflective material, something that's a little bit more scuffed up. See how this works? And of course, if I make this completely black, I will get just the high contrast diffuse material. I might be able to change this high contrast a little bit to make it stand out a little bit more. We can do that by taking the upper colors and kind of bringing up the contrast a little bit. Maybe we'll take the lights and slide them in. So you see what's happening here. So you can adjust this diffuse influence a little bit more to match, you know, whatever you want your rough reflection to look like. If we come back here, we'll see how that mixes in. We'll select the white side. We'll make it all the way white again. We'll slide in our black. And that mixes fairly well, I think. Okay, so you can see how the controls work on this. I think it's a fairly clever way to manage to get a reflective material that is at varying degrees of roughness. You could also kind of go in the middle here. You can really, you know, stylize this in any particular way you want. Let's say we take our white color and the high reflection, and we'll bring that down a little bit. And then we'll go maybe over to our black color and we'll bring that up just a little bit. So we're mixing in a little bit more. And you see we have something that's a little bit more in between. So we're getting, you know, it's got a pretty good fresnel, but it's not a complete high gloss mirror all the way on the outside. And then the normals facing us head on, they are roughened, but you still see hints in there of high reflectivity. And a little bit of shadow casting in there, which would be appropriate. Now, the way we would want to change color on this, let's say that the material would be of a particular color. Normally for these materials we want to have a way to input a color and then alter that color using the node group. In the case of reflectivity, we actually do want to change the color on the outside. So let's say we wanted this to be more of a gold color. We want it to be this exact reflectivity, but we want it to be gold. What we would do is we would tab out of here and we would add a color saturation node, and we would knock down the saturation a little bit. So let's say we take it all the way, we'll take it down to 0.5. We're going to make this, well, no, maybe not that much, 0.7. Oops. Excuse me, 0.7. I think I may have messed up the default there. Let me try that again. Yeah, hue should be 0.5. There we go. Saturation 0.7. And then, in addition to that, so we still do have some of the color influence in there. In addition to that, we would add an RGB curve. And then we would use this curve adjustment to get the color that we want. So if we want a gold, we can add a curve on here on the different color channels to get gold. Now, one quick word of advice. When you are mixing or changing color curves, taking away is better than adding. Okay, reducing color is better than adding. When you add color curves, you start to add more of a glow kind of influence. We don't want to do that, particularly on the low lights. So what we'll do here is we'll jump in, and we want it to be kind of a gold color. So we're going to take the blues out. So we'll drop out the blues significantly. We get this kind of greeny looking color. We're going to take the red, and because we do have to compensate for those blues a bit, we'll pop the reds up just a little bit. And then to get the right amount of our gold color, we either need to add green to that to make it more yellow, or take it away to make it more of a bronze color. And then herein we can generate our final gold looking color. So you see how this works. It's kind of a reddish rose brass kind of looking tone. We take our reds up a little bit more. See it's starting to glow a little bit there. Take our blues out a little bit more to get more of a gold color. So you see how this works. Okay, this is how you would then generate your different tones for your metallic looking materials. Make sense? Now, if we wanted to have a mixture of different kinds of reflectivity, we can use some other kind of material map to map in high reflection and then some of the more roughened textures or materials. That's something that we'll look at kind of down the road there. All right, let's see if we can build this from scratch. So if I was going to build this all anew, I would start with a material that is our reflectivity material. Move up our output up here, slide that into the output. I would add in my diffuse. And I know we broke this down, but we'll just build it real quick just to make sure we're all clear on it. I would then add to my diffuse a curve adjustment, because we want to make our diffuse look more metallic. And on this curve adjustment, we would bring up our lights quite a bit. We would add a bit of a contrast curve, so we get some of this, a little bit of a specularity in there. Now we want to kind of match the color tone, and this should work no matter what environment you're using. If you do this in one environment, it ought to be kind of plug and play later on when you change your environments. If we compare this to our reflective tone, we want it to look very similar, so it might be a little too bright. Bring down the darks a little bit. That looks pretty good. So the blues kind of match the blues, and the tan matches the tan fairly well. Maybe bring up the lights a little bit more. So right about here. Now what we want to do is we want to add a mix node. We're going to put the output of the diffuse on top, and then the output of the reflectivity material on the bottom. And this is our output, so it's mixed half and half right now. And then on top of that, we're going to input another material, which is going to be our Fresnel material, Fresnel map. And we'll pop that into the factor, and then on top of that, we will add a converter, we'll add a color ramp. And the black will represent the black interior, the white will represent the white exterior there, and the outside normals. And then we're ready to rock and roll. We can change these any way that we want to get the kind of material that we want. So if I take the black and slide it in, the texture becomes more rough, maintaining that Fresnel effect. If I want to reduce the Fresnel effect, I can go to the white side, bring down the color, and then we'll mix in more of the diffuse. And we've already seen kind of how this works. Now, one last thing that I need to do, because we are missing the shadow on the diffuse texture, is I need to add a group that I've already made. So I've already made a shadow mask group. We already created that, and we separated that out. And just so you can remember what it is, the shadow mask group is this node setup of the OpenGL light. Tab out of that, and I'm going to set this right here. And we're going to drop the curve output to this bottom color. Again, I don't know why that's showing up. Hopefully that doesn't show up on yours. If I go to my node here, collapse and hide unused sockets, it'll get rid of that one. So all of the nodes inside of this are already preset to generate a shadow. If I come out of that, you can see that it's now casting shadow on itself while it's still demonstrating the Fresnel effect. And the shadow is only of a quality that is appropriate for the type of roughness that's there. The more rough that I make this, the more shadow will show up. If I go up here and click on my whites and I bring them all the way down to black, now I have a reflective material that's very rough and has shadows being cast on it. Okay, so that's my idea. You can take this and run with it. You can create this node group, and now out of this one tutorial, based on the last tutorial and this one, we should have now 3 separate node groups for you to use. We have one for diffuse lighting, that is just using the diffuse colors, and then any other color that we're using underneath that. We have a shadow mask that's using an OpenGL light array plus the diffuse lighting to use our world colors and our light influence, plus the shadows. And then now we have our reflective material that has the ability to change settings to make it more rough or more mirror-like with a sort of an accurate Fresnel effect. And we talked about how to generate different colors from that. So 3 different node groups so far and counting. Hopefully next time we will be looking at a different kind of roughness, a different way to generate roughness, and maybe we'll look at a way to generate a kind of a subsurface material that involves a kind of a paint fleck, car paint kind of texture and material. And maybe we can look even at generating a specularity node and some other kind of subsurface scattering. And then, of course, down the line, we are going to look at transparency. We're going to be looking at refraction and a way to come up with kind of our own bogus refraction given the limitations that we have. So good luck with this. I wish you the best of luck and happy blending.